Everyone's seen a World War II bomber. The iconic silhouettes, the roar of radial engines, the contrails over Europe or the Pacific. But almost no one has actually seen every American bomber used in that war. Most people know the B-17, a few know the B-29, and that's usually where the conversation stops. But the real story is bigger, messier, and far more impressive than a couple of famous aircraft. The United States built an air force from almost nothing and turned it into the most powerful aerial bombardment machine the world had ever seen. And to do that, they didn't rely on one or two planes. They built dozens of them. Different shapes, different roles, different philosophies of war. Some were revolutionary. Some were disasters that still somehow flew combat missions. Some were forgotten the moment the war ended, replaced by newer designs that made them look ancient. And some are still considered among the greatest flying machines ever constructed. If you're new here, and this is the kind of content that pulls you in, make sure you subscribe right now, because we go deep on every machine, every mission, and every story that the history books skip over. This is the complete picture. Every American bomber used in World War II, not just the famous ones. All of them. Let's start before the war even begins, because the aircraft that fought in 1941 and 1942 weren't designed in a hurry. They came from a decade of theory, argument, and sometimes bitter debate inside the U.S. Army Air Corps about what strategic bombing even meant and whether it could win a war on its own. Some generals believed that bombers flying in tight formations at high altitude could defend themselves without fighter escorts. Others thought that was suicidal nonsense. Both sides would turn out to be partially right and catastrophically wrong at the same time. And that tension, that debate, shaped every bomber the United States ever built for this war. Before the big four-engine heavies entered service, the Americans were flying aircraft that look almost quaint by comparison. The Douglas B-18 Bolo is a perfect example. It entered service in 1936 and won a competitive fly-off against the Boeing Model 299, which would later become the B-17. The Army chose the B-18 partly because of cost, partly because of risk aversion, and partly because the idea of a massive four-engine bomber still scared the budget committees. The B-18 was essentially a military conversion of the DC-2 airliner. It had a wide, round fuselage, twin Wright Cyclone engines, and the kind of smooth, rounded lines that made it look almost civilian. Which, in a sense, it was. Its bomb load was modest. Its range was limited. Its defensive armament was light. By the time the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, the B-18 was already obsolete as a frontline bomber. But obsolete didn't mean useless. The B-18 found a second life as a submarine hunter. Modified with magnetic anomaly detection equipment called MAD gear and loaded with depth charges, the B-18 flew anti-submarine patrols over the Atlantic and the Caribbean during the early years of the war. It was never glamorous work. But German U-boats were sinking Allied shipping at a catastrophic rate in 1942. And the B-18 was one of the tools used to push back against that. It sank at least 2 German submarines. Small numbers on paper, but each one represented a crew of sailors who made it home, because a B-18 was overhead. Eventually, the B-18 was completely replaced by more capable aircraft, but its contribution to the anti-submarine campaign in the war's darkest early months deserves more credit than it usually gets. While the B-18 was aging out, 2 aircraft were emerging that would define American bombing strategy for the entire war. The first was the consolidated B-24 Liberator. The second was the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. Between them, these 2 heavy bombers would fly more missions, drop more bombs, suffer more losses, and carry more crews to their deaths than any other aircraft in American history. And they couldn't have been more different. Let's talk about the B-17 first, because the B-17 is where the American strategic bombing doctrine was born, tested, and nearly destroyed. Boeing's Model 299 first flew in July 1935. It was massive by the standards of its time. 4 engines. A sleek, almost beautiful fuselage. Multiple gun positions mounted in blisters along the fuselage. When a reporter saw it for the first time and counted all those machine gun positions, he called it a flying fortress, and the name stuck. The Army Air Corps ordered a small batch, evaluated it, lost one in a crash, nearly canceled the whole program, and then slowly, grudgingly, expanded their orders as the design proved itself. By the time the United States entered the war, the B-17E was in production, a substantially improved version with a tail gun position, a new dorsal turret, and a much more capable defensive setup than the original design. The B-17 was meant to fly high, very high. Above 25,000 feet, where it was thought enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire would struggle to reach it. Its Norden bomb sight, a sophisticated analog computer that used gyroscopes and wind correction to calculate bomb drop points, was supposed to deliver bombs with pinpoint precision from those extreme altitudes. The theory was elegant: fly high, fly fast, fly in tight formations, and bomb specific industrial targets like ball-bearing factories, oil refineries, and rail yards. Destroy the enemy's ability to make war, and ground forces wouldn't have to fight through every city. The B-17's early combat missions over Europe quickly shattered a lot of those assumptions. High altitude brought intense cold that froze guns and oxygen systems. Tight formations were hard to maintain over long distances. And most importantly, the German Luftwaffe's fighters could absolutely reach those altitudes, and they were deadly. The missions to Schweinfurt in 1943 proved it beyond any doubt. On October 14, 1943, 291 B-17s flew deep into Germany to attack the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, a target that American planners believed was so critical that destroying it would cripple German war production. There were no fighter escorts. American fighters didn't have the range to accompany the bombers all the way in. The Luftwaffe was waiting. When it was over, 60 B-17s had been shot down. Another 17 were so badly damaged they never flew again. Out of 2,900 crew members who flew that mission, 650 were killed, captured, or missing. And the ball-bearing factories were back in partial operation within weeks. It was one of the worst single-day losses in the history of military aviation. And yet the B-17 flew on. Partly because the Air Corps had invested too much in the concept to abandon it, and partly because the aircraft itself was genuinely extraordinary. Stories of B-17s returning from missions with half a wing missing, engines on fire, massive holes in the fuselage, hydraulic systems destroyed, and still managing to land safely. Those stories weren't propaganda, they were real. The B-17 could absorb punishment that would have turned other aircraft into debris clouds. Crews loved it, feared it, cursed it, and swore by it. More than 12,700 B-17s were built. It flew in every theater of the war. Its later variants, particularly the B-17G, added a chin turret to counter the head-on fighter attacks the Luftwaffe had developed specifically to exploit the early model's blind spots. And eventually, with the arrival of long-range P-51 Mustang escorts, the deep penetration missions that had been so suicidal became survivable again. Now, the other half of America's strategic bombing effort, the B-24 Liberator. If the B-17 was the romantic icon, the B-24 was the workhorse. It wasn't beautiful. It had a slab-sided, boxy fuselage that crews nicknamed the Flying Coffin, sometimes affectionately and sometimes not. Its high-mounted Davis wing was efficient and gave it excellent range, but it was also a weakness. The wing didn't tolerate battle damage as well as the B-17's design. A hard hit in the wrong place could send a B-24 into an uncontrollable dive. And unlike the B-17, which sometimes seemed to glide home on stubbornness alone, B-24s that took serious damage had a habit of coming apart. But the B-24 had range that the B-17 couldn't match. It could carry a comparable bomb load farther, which made it the choice for the Pacific Theater, where distances were enormous, and for operations in the Mediterranean and North Africa, where long overwater flights were routine. More B-24s were built than any other American combat aircraft in the entire war. Over 18,000 of them rolled off assembly lines from Consolidated's factory in San Diego, from Ford's massive Willow Run plant in Michigan, and from facilities in Fort Worth and Tulsa. Ford's involvement alone is a story. Henry Ford had claimed that the Willow Run plant could produce a B-24 every hour. It took time to reach that rate, and the early production bombers were plagued with quality issues. But eventually Willow Run lived up to its promises and became one of the most remarkable industrial achievements of the war. The B-24's most famous single mission is probably the low-level attack on the Ploiești oil refineries in Romania on August 1, 1943. Coded Operation Tidal Wave, it sent 177 B-24s skimming across the Romanian countryside at rooftop height in an attempt to surprise the heavily defended refineries. The attack was a disaster tactically. German and Romanian defenses were alerted, and the low-altitude approach that was supposed to give the bombers a surprise advantage instead put them directly in the path of every gun the enemy had. 53 B-24s were lost. 5 Medals of Honor were awarded for that single mission, the most for any single military operation in American history. The refineries were damaged but recovered quickly, and yet Ploiești became a symbol of something uniquely American. a willingness to attempt the nearly impossible, accept terrible losses, and keep going. The B-24 flew everywhere. It hunted submarines in the Atlantic. It bombed Japanese shipping in the Pacific. It flew from North Africa against German positions in Italy and the Balkans. It flew from England with the 8th Air Force against Germany. It flew from India over the Himalayas into China. No single aircraft type covered more of the war's geography than the Liberator. While the B-17 and B-24 were hammering strategic targets from high altitude over Europe, a different kind of bomber was fighting a different kind of war in the Pacific and the Mediterranean. The North American B-25 Mitchell was a medium bomber, smaller than the heavies, faster, lower flying, and designed for tactical rather than strategic missions. It was twin-engine, with a distinctive twin-tail assembly and a greenhouse nose that gave its bomb aimer a wide field of view. It was named after Brigadier General Billy Mitchell, the maverick Air Corps officer who had been court-martialed in 1925 for publicly accusing military leaders of incompetence and criminal negligence in their failure to develop air power. Naming a bomber after him was the Army Air Force's way of acknowledging, a couple of decades too late, that he had been right. The B-25 became famous almost immediately after Pearl Harbor. In April 1942, Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle led 16 B-25s off the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Hornet in a one-way bombing raid on Tokyo, Osaka, and other Japanese cities. The Doolittle raid, as it became known, was not a major military success in terms of damage inflicted. The bombs that fell on Japan did limited physical harm, but the psychological and strategic impact was enormous. It proved that Japan's home islands were vulnerable. It forced Japanese military planners to divert resources to home defense, and it gave the American public its first taste of offensive action after months of devastating defeats. No one had ever launched B-25s from a carrier before, and no one had planned for it to be done again. The aircraft that launched couldn't land back on the ship. Every one of Doolittle's crews knew they were flying toward China and hoping to find a place to land before they ran out of fuel. Most of them made it to China. A few crashed at sea. Several were captured by Japanese forces and executed. Doolittle himself bailed out over China and eventually made his way back to Allied lines. He expected to be court-martialed for losing all 16 aircraft. Instead, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. In the Pacific, the B-25 evolved into something unexpected. Ground attack crews in New Guinea began experimenting with stripping out the nose bombardier position and replacing it with banks of forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns. Some aircraft ended up with as many as 8 guns firing straight ahead. These modified B-25s became low-level strafers, screaming across the water at mast height to attack Japanese shipping. The technique called skip bombing, in which the pilot would release the bomb so it would skip across the water like a stone and slam into the hull of a ship below the waterline, turned the B-25 into one of the most effective anti-shipping weapons of the Pacific War. General Kenny's 5th Air Force in the Southwest Pacific used these gunship B-25s to devastating effect, especially at the Battle of the Bismarck Sea in March 1943, where B-25s and other aircraft destroyed a Japanese convoy of 8 transports and 4 destroyers, killing thousands of Japanese troops who were attempting to reinforce New Guinea. Over 9,800 B-25s were built. They served with every Allied air force that flew them, including the British, the Soviets, the Dutch, the Chinese, and the Australians. The Douglas A-20 Havoc, or Boston as the British called it, was in some ways the forgotten bomber of the American war effort. It was an attack bomber, designed to fly fast and low, dropping bombs and strafing targets directly in support of ground troops. It predated the American entry into the war. France had ordered A-20s before falling in 1940, and Britain had taken delivery of them before the United States was even fighting. By the time the Americans entered the war, the A-20 was already a proven design. It was fast, maneuverable, and highly effective at low-altitude work. It flew extensively in North Africa, where it attacked German and Italian supply lines, airfields, and troop concentrations. It flew over the Mediterranean. It flew over the Pacific, particularly in the Southwest Pacific Theater, where General Kenny used them for the same kind of low-level, high-aggression attacks that characterized his whole approach to air warfare. The A-20 wasn't a headliner. It didn't get the famous missions or the dramatic long-distance raids, but it flew close support missions day after day, which is the kind of work that grinds down an enemy's ability to function at the tactical level. Crews loved it for its speed and responsiveness. It felt like a fighter with bomb racks, which in a lot of ways it was. Over 7,000 were produced, with thousands going to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease. Soviet crews flew A-20s extensively on the Eastern Front and considered them among the most effective American aircraft they received. The Martin B-26 Marauder had one of the worst reputations of any American aircraft to enter service during the war, and most of that reputation was unfair. When it first arrived at training bases in 1941, it killed so many pilots so quickly that it earned nicknames like the Widowmaker, the Flying Prostitute, meaning no visible means of support because of its short, stubby wings, and the Baltimore Whore. Pilots who had trained on forgiving, slow aircraft with long, generous wings were suddenly asked to fly something that cruised at nearly 300 miles per hour, had a wing loading higher than any aircraft they had ever touched, and required a landing speed that felt more like a jet than a propeller-driven bomber. Touch it wrong on landing and you were dead. The accident rate in training was alarming. Congressional hearings were held. There was genuine talk of canceling the program entirely. The investigation concluded that the aircraft wasn't inherently unsafe. It was being flown by pilots who hadn't been properly trained for its demanding handling characteristics. Training was revamped, procedures were updated, and the Marauder's accident rate dropped to acceptable levels. Once pilots learned to fly it properly, they discovered something remarkable. The B-26 was a genuinely excellent aircraft. It was fast, powerful, and carried a respectable bomb load. Its twin Pratt & Whitney double Wasp engines gave it performance that most enemy fighters respected, and it was designed to fly at medium altitudes on tactical bombing missions, which meant it operated below the extreme cold and thin air that caused so many problems for the high-altitude heavies. The Marauder went to war in the Pacific first, flying missions from Australia against Japanese targets. Then it moved to the Mediterranean, flying with the 9th Air Force in North Africa and later Italy and Southern Europe. And then it came to England and Northwest Europe, where it flew thousands of sorties against German airfields, rail yards, bridges, coastal defenses, and supply depots in France and the Low Countries in the lead-up to and aftermath of D-Day. By the end of the war, the B-26 had one of the lowest loss rates of any bomber in the European theater. It finished the war with the best overall safety record of any American bomber, remarkable for an aircraft that had been so close to cancellation. Over 5,200 were built. They flew with the British, the South Africans, and the Free French. They participated in the preparation for the Normandy landings, hammering German coastal defenses and transportation infrastructure across France for months before June 6, 1944. The Martin B-26 Marauder deserves far more credit than it receives. While the medium bombers were supporting ground operations, American engineers were already working on something that would take the war to a completely different level. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress was the most technologically advanced bomber of World War II. It wasn't even close. Nothing else came near it. It was enormous. It had a wingspan of 141 feet and a length of nearly 100 feet. Its 4 Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines each produced over 2,000 horsepower and were so powerful and so new that they were prone to catastrophic in-flight engine fires during the early months of service. It was pressurized, which meant crews could fly at 30,000 feet or higher without oxygen masks and without the bone-freezing cold that tortured B-17 and B-24 crews. It had a remote-controlled defensive gun system, meaning gunners didn't sit directly at their gun positions. They sat at sighting stations with periscopic sights and used a central fire control computer to aim remotely operated gun barbettes mounted in the fuselage. The gunner could control multiple guns from one position, and the system could automatically compensate for factors like airspeed, altitude, and gravity drop. It was decades ahead of its time. It had a range of over 3,000 miles and could carry a bomb load that dwarfed anything that had come before it. The B-29 cost more to develop and produce than the Manhattan Project, a fact that is often forgotten in the shadow of the atomic bomb it would eventually carry. Getting the B-29 into combat was one of the most complex logistical challenges of the war. The plan was to base the aircraft in India and fly them over the Himalayas, the massive mountain range known as the Hump, to bases in China, from which they could attack Japanese targets. The problems were staggering. Everything the B-29s needed, fuel, bombs, spare parts, ammunition, had to be flown over the Hump because there was no ground route through the mountains. Every bombing mission required multiple hump flights just to stockpile enough fuel to fill the aircraft. The results were disappointing. The B-29s flew their first combat mission from India in June 1944 and attacked the railroad repair shops at Bangkok, Thailand. Later missions targeted Japanese steel production in Kyushu, Japan, making them the first American bombers to attack the Japanese home islands. But the logistics never worked well enough to sustain a serious campaign from China, and the results didn't justify the enormous cost. Everything changed when the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were captured from Japan in the summer of 1944. From the Marianas, the B-29s could reach the Japanese home islands without crossing the hump. Supply ships could bring everything needed directly to the island bases. General Curtis LeMay took command of the B-29 force in the Marianas in January 1945 and immediately realized that the high-altitude precision bombing doctrine was producing miserable results. The jet stream winds over Japan were so powerful and so variable that precision bombing from 30,000 feet was nearly impossible. Bombs were scattering miles from their targets. Japan's cities were still standing. LeMay made a decision that was either visionary or monstrous, depending on your perspective, and possibly both. He stripped the B-29s of most of their defensive guns to reduce weight, loaded them with incendiary bombs instead of high explosives, and sent them in low, at night, in massive formations. The targets were the residential and industrial areas of Japan's major cities. Japanese cities were built primarily of wood. Incendiary bombs turned them into infernos. On the night of March 9–10, 1945, 279 B-29s attacked Tokyo with incendiary bombs. The firestorm they created burned approximately 16 square miles of the city to the ground. An estimated 80,000 to 100,000 people died in a single night. It was one of the deadliest conventional bombing raids in history. LeMay continued the campaign relentlessly. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and dozens of smaller cities were burned. Japan's industrial capacity was being destroyed, not by precise attacks on specific factories, but by simply burning down the cities in which industry existed. By the summer of 1945, Japan was devastated. Its industry was crippled, its navy was destroyed, its cities were ruins. Then, in August, 2 B-29s carried out the missions that ended the war. The Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. Bockscar dropped an atomic bomb on Nagasaki on August 9th. Japan surrendered on August 15th. The B-29 had done what the entire strategic bombing campaign in Europe, with its thousands of sorties and tens of thousands of casualties, had ultimately failed to do. It had forced an enemy nation to surrender through air power alone, or at least it was the final instrument in a campaign that made invasion seem more terrible than surrender. More than 3,900 B-29s were built. They were used exclusively in the Pacific Theater, and they remain the only aircraft ever to have dropped nuclear weapons in combat. But the story of American bombers in World War II isn't told only by the famous names and the famous missions. There are aircraft in this story that most people have never heard of and would struggle to identify from a photograph. These aircraft flew real missions, real combat, real consequences. They deserve to be part of the record. The North American A-36 Apache, sometimes called the Invader in error, because that name belonged to another aircraft, was essentially a dive bomber variant of the P-51 Mustang fighter. It had dive brakes fitted to the wings, bomb racks under each wing and under the fuselage, and the same Allison engine as the early production Mustangs. It flew combat in North Africa and Italy, primarily in close support and interdiction roles. It was fast and capable, but the dive bomber concept was falling out of favor, and the A-36 was quickly replaced in production by later Mustang variants focused purely on the fighter role. Still, the A-36 flew more than 23,000 combat sorties in the Mediterranean theater and performed well enough that crews respected it even if the air forces weren't interested in buying more. The Douglas A-26 Invader, getting the name right this time, was perhaps the finest light bomber of the war. It was designed to replace both the A-20 Havoc and the B-26 Marauder and ended up outlasting both of them by decades. In World War II, it entered combat in Europe in late 1944 and in the Pacific in 1945, so it never had the time to accumulate the kind of record it would have built if it had arrived earlier. But pilots who flew it were immediately impressed. It was fast, very fast for a bomber. It could exceed 350 miles per hour, which put it beyond the reach of many enemy interceptors. It was powerful, with either a glass nose for a bombardier or a solid nose packed with 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns for strafing. It was maneuverable, nimble enough that some pilots said it felt more like an oversized fighter than a bomber. The A-26 would go on to serve in Korea and Vietnam, which tells you everything about how capable it was. In 1945, it was already obsolete relative to jet aircraft, and yet it kept flying combat missions for 2 decades. That's not a common distinction. The consolidated Vultee B-32 Dominator was supposed to be insurance. When the Army Air Forces contracted for the B-29, they were aware of how technically ambitious the program was, and they wanted a backup in case the B-29 failed to deliver. The B-32 was that backup. It was a large, 4-engine heavy bomber, similar in size and capability to the B-29, but without the pressurization, the remote gun system, or the advanced fire control technology. It was simpler, more conventional, and therefore cheaper and easier to produce. Inevitably, the B-29 didn't fail. It was delayed, it had problems, but it eventually delivered results that justified every dollar spent. The B-32, suddenly unnecessary, was produced in small numbers and saw limited combat service in the Pacific in 1945. Its most historically significant moment came on August 18, 1945, after Japan had already announced its surrender. 2 B-32s flying a reconnaissance mission over Tokyo were attacked by Japanese fighters. It was, as far as anyone knows, the last aerial combat of World War II. A gunner on one of the B-32s, Sergeant Anthony Marchione, was killed during that engagement, making him one of the last, if not the last, American airman to die in aerial combat in World War II. 3 days later, Japan formally signed the surrender documents. The Boeing XB-39 and the various other experimental and prototype bombers that were developed during the war are largely known only to specialists, but they represent the constant pressure of American industry to find something better, faster, more powerful, more capable. Not all of them flew combat. Many never left the testing phase, but they kept the technological edge sharp and fed lessons forward into post-war aircraft development. The Northrop YB-35 flying wing was perhaps the most radical American bomber concept of the war, though it never reached operational status. Jack Northrop had been fascinated by the idea of a pure flying wing since the 1920s. No fuselage, no tail, just a massive, thick wing with everything, crew, engines, bombs, inside it. The aerodynamic efficiency was potentially enormous. In theory, a flying wing could carry more payload farther than any conventional design at the same weight. The YB-35 was a piston-engine flying wing built to bomber specifications, and it flew in 1946, technically just after the war. It never got to prove itself in combat. Engine problems, stability issues, and the sudden availability of jet engines that promised a whole different kind of performance caused the Army Air Forces to lose interest in the piston-engine flying wing program. Northrop later developed the YB-49 jet flying wing, which also failed to reach production, largely through circumstances that Northrop believed were political rather than technical. Northrop's flying wing concept wouldn't be vindicated until the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber flew in 1989, built on principles that Jack Northrop had spent his entire career fighting to prove. But the story of American bombers in World War II isn't just about the machines. It's about the men who flew them, and the conditions under which they flew them, which were often so brutal and so terrifying that the aircraft themselves were almost secondary to what was happening inside them. Consider what it meant to be a B-17 bombardier in 1943. You sat in the nose of the aircraft, in a plexiglass bubble that felt like it was hanging in midair. The temperature at 25,000 feet in a European winter was often 40 or 50 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. The oxygen mask could ice over and suffocate you. Your hands, working the Norden bomb site, were encased in electrically heated gloves over which you wore leather gloves, and still your fingers could go numb. German anti-aircraft fire, called flak by the crews, came up in black bursts that could tear through the aircraft's thin aluminum skin and kill anyone in the path of the fragments. A piece of flak the size of a golf ball could take off an arm. A larger fragment could tear out an engine or detonate a bomb still in the rack. And through all of this, you were supposed to hold course, hold altitude, hold speed, and keep your eyes on the bomb site during the bomb run, which could last several minutes. Evasive action to dodge flak was forbidden during the bomb run, because evasive action ruined the bombing accuracy, and the whole point of being there was to drop the bombs accurately, so you flew straight and level through exploding steel and held your nerve or you didn't. Some men had what was called flak happy, a kind of combat stress reaction in which the accumulated terror of repeated missions produced tremors, nightmares, inability to concentrate, emotional breakdown. The Army Air Forces recognized it, but had limited ability to treat it. The standard prescription was rest and reassignment, which helped some men and didn't help others. The tour of duty in the 8th Air Force in 1943 was 25 missions. That number sounds manageable until you understand that in late 1943, the statistical probability of completing 25 missions without being shot down, killed, or seriously wounded was well below 50%. Some crews completed their tours. Many more didn't. The Memphis Belle, a B-17F, became famous partly because it was one of the first crews to complete the full 25-mission tour and return to the United States. The crew was toured around America to boost morale and promote war bonds. The fact that completing 25 missions was extraordinary enough to warrant a national publicity tour tells you everything about what the odds looked like. The crews who flew the B-29s over Japan faced different but equally terrifying conditions. The incendiary raids that LeMay launched in early 1945 sent the bombers in low, which brought them into range of lighter anti-aircraft weapons that couldn't reach them at high altitude. The fires they created over Japanese cities were so intense that they generated their own weather, thermal updrafts so powerful that they could flip a B-29 or throw it hundreds of feet in seconds. Crews who flew through the smoke and heat reported the smell of burning cities penetrating the sealed pressure cabins. Some reported never being able to get that smell out of their memories. The men who flew the anti-submarine patrols over the Atlantic faced a different kind of fear. Not the sudden violence of fighters and flak, but the grinding, exhausting terror of hours and hours over open ocean, far from any land, watching for the faint shape of a periscope or the wake of a submarine. If an engine failed over the mid-Atlantic in 1942 or 1943, ditching in the ocean was often a death sentence. The water was cold enough to kill in minutes. Rescue was uncertain and slow. The crews knew this and flew anyway, because the alternative was to leave the shipping lanes undefended and watch the U-boats sink the supplies that Britain and the Soviet Union needed to survive. American industry's role in this story cannot be overstated. At the start of 1940, the United States Army Air Corps had roughly 800 combat aircraft of all types. By the end of 1944, American factories were producing roughly 100,000 aircraft per year. Not all of those were bombers. Many were fighters, transports, trainers, and liaison aircraft. But the bomber production numbers alone are staggering. Nearly 13,000 B-17s, more than 18,000 B-24s, over 9,800 B-25s, about 5,200 B-26s, roughly 7,400 A-20s, more than 2,400 A-26s, nearly 3,900 B-29s. These are manufacturing achievements without precedent in the history of aviation. Before the war, it took months to build a single four-engine heavy bomber. By 1944, Consolidated's factory at San Diego was completing a B-24 in something approaching 12 hours of final assembly time, with components pre-manufactured and flowing into the factory on a precisely coordinated schedule. Henry Kaiser, the man who had revolutionized Liberty ship construction by applying industrial mass production techniques to shipbuilding, looked at the bomber production problem and proposed building B-24s using similar methods. Consolidated and the Air Forces resisted, partly from institutional pride and partly from legitimate concerns about whether assembly line techniques developed for ships could translate to aircraft with far tighter tolerances. The debate was ultimately resolved by results. Ford's Willow Run plant, which eventually produced a finished B-24 every 63 minutes at peak production, proved that mass production of complex aircraft was not only possible, but achievable at a scale that staggered the imagination. The women who worked those assembly lines, doing precision manufacturing work that required skill, focus, and physical dexterity, as well as the strength to wrestle heavy components into place, were as much a part of the bombing offensive as any crew member who flew the finished aircraft. The cultural image of Rosie the Riveter was based in real women doing real work on real aircraft that were flying real combat missions. When a B-17 crossed the Dutch coast on the way to a target in Germany, it was carrying with it the labor of thousands of people who would never know whether the aircraft they helped build survived the mission. The navigation of these aircraft was another dimension of the story that often goes unappreciated. Before satellite navigation, before inertial navigation systems, before any of the electronic aids that modern aircraft take for granted, navigators had to find their way across hundreds or thousands of miles of ocean or enemy-held territory, using dead reckoning, celestial navigation, radio compass bearings, and their own skill and judgment. A B-29 flying from Tinian to Tokyo and back covered roughly 3,000 miles round trip, much of it over open ocean. If the navigator miscalculated the jet stream's effect on ground speed, the aircraft might miss the target, miss the coast on the return, and fly into the ocean. Celestial navigation in a pressurized bomber at 30,000 feet, using a sextant through a plexiglass window while wearing oxygen equipment, required a level of skill that took months to develop and years to master. The navigators who kept these formations on track deserve recognition alongside the pilots who flew them and the bombardiers who aimed the bombs. The electronic warfare dimension of the bombing campaign is another largely forgotten chapter. As German radar and fighter control systems became more sophisticated, American aircraft began carrying jamming equipment to blind German radar. The B-17G and B-24 formations were sometimes accompanied by specially modified aircraft carrying jammers and chaff, strips of metallic foil cut to the wavelength of German radar that created false returns and cluttered the displays. The British developed the window technique for chaff dispensing and shared it with the Americans. The back and forth between German radar operators trying to track the formations and American electronic warfare specialists trying to blind them was a constant technological competition that escalated throughout the war. Pathfinder aircraft, equipped with radar bombing systems like H-2X, which was the American version of the British H-2S, could find targets through clouds using radar returns from the ground. On days when cloud cover made visual bombing impossible, which in Northern Europe was a very significant percentage of days, Pathfinder aircraft led the formations, dropped marker bombs when their radar showed them over the target, and the rest of the formation bombed on the Pathfinder's smoke rather than a visual sighting through the Norden bomb site. This reduced accuracy compared to ideal visual bombing conditions, but it allowed the campaign to continue through weather that would otherwise have grounded everything. The argument about whether the strategic bombing campaign was effective has continued for 80 years and shows no sign of being resolved. The official United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted immediately after the war, with access to German records and German industrial personnel, reached the somewhat uncomfortable conclusion that the campaign had been less effective than its proponents claimed. German industrial production had actually increased in some categories through 1944, even as the bombing intensified, partly because Albert Speer's rationalization of German industry had been so successful, and partly because Germany had significant excess capacity that bombing forced it to use more efficiently. The campaign did eventually inflict decisive damage, particularly on oil production and transportation infrastructure in late 1944 and early 1945. By early 1945, German tanks couldn't move for lack of fuel. German aircraft sat on airfields because there was no aviation fuel. German troops couldn't be moved by rail because the rail network had been bombed into near paralysis. The bombing campaign didn't win the war alone, but it made the ground war radically less costly than it would otherwise have been. In the Pacific, the B-29 campaign was even more decisive because Japan's industrial economy was more concentrated and more vulnerable to fire than Germany's dispersed factories. And of course, in the end, two B-29s made the debate academic. Once the atomic bomb existed and worked, arguments about whether conventional bombing could defeat Japan became historical footnotes. The men who planned, built, crewed, maintained, navigated, and flew these aircraft paid an extraordinary price. American air forces in World War II suffered approximately 88,000 killed in action, the highest casualty rate of any branch of the American military when measured as a percentage of those who served. The 8th Air Force alone, flying from England, suffered more than 47,000 casualties, including more than 26,000 dead. These numbers are abstract until you translate them into individual aircraft. Each B-17 that went down carried a crew of 10. Each B-24 carried 10 or 11. A single mission that lost 60 bombers, like Schweinfurt, meant the deaths or capture of 600 men on one afternoon. The decorations awarded to bomber crews reflect the scale of the courage that was expected as routine. In addition to the 5 Medals of Honor awarded for the Ploesti mission, dozens more were awarded to bomber crewmen throughout the war. The Medal of Honor citations for bomber crew members often describe actions that seem almost incomprehensible. Pilots who kept aircraft in the air after losing engines, after being blinded by wounds, after fire had broken out in the fuselage, so that the rest of the crew could bail out before the aircraft went down. Gunners who continued firing while wounded. Bombardiers who completed bomb runs with the aircraft on fire around them. These were not exceptional men in the sense of being fundamentally different from other men. They were ordinary men placed in extraordinary circumstances and responding with whatever they had. That is perhaps the most important thing the record of these aircraft and these crews reveals. Not the technology, not the production statistics, not the strategic analysis. The fact that ordinary men did extraordinary things because the circumstances demanded it, and because they had been trained, organized, and equipped by a nation that had decided it was willing to